Hi, I'm Erynn Gordon, Director of Genetic Counseling for the Coriell Institute for Medical Research. And I'm happy to talk to you this evening about interpreting your CPMC results for Crohn's disease. You may remember from other educational sessions that we've done that there are a few important components when thinking about your CPMC results, and we're going to talk about those this evening. We're going to talk about interpreting your CPMC results for Crohn's disease, and some of the key factors that we're going to think about are the genetic versus environmental contribution to Crohn's disease, the influence of other genetic variants on disease, genetic variants reported by the CPMC, implications for family members, limitations of CPMC testing, and resources for more information. So this is a picture that you might have seen before. It's included in all of our results. And what this really illustrates is the genetic contribution versus the non-genetic contribution to each disease. In this particular case, for Crohn's disease, we can see that about 54% of the disease is caused by genetic factors and about 46% by non-genetic or environmental factors. It's important to note that this genetic component, this side of the scale, is not just a single gene. So it's not just the variant that we're telling you about, but there are lots of different genes that make up this genetic component. Some of them have a larger effect, some of them have a smaller effect. At this point, we're really only able to tell you about one of those genes, and in this case, it's the IL-23R gene and a particular variant in that gene that's been associated with Crohn's disease. Again, this image may look familiar. We use an image like this in all of our reports, and what these people are intended to illustrate is the frequency of each individual result. So in this particular case, we are looking at a protective variant, a variant that when seen actually is known to reduce your risk for the disease, in this case Crohn's disease, and a non-protective variant, a variant that doesn't necessarily increase your risk but doesn't decrease your risk. So this image again is showing you the distribution and the frequency of each of these results. So we know that about 89 out of 100 people, 89% of the population, is expected to have 2 copies of the non-protective variant. That's sort of the standard in the population, which again neither increases nor decreases your risk of Crohn's disease. About 10% of the population is expected to have 1 copy of the non-protective variant and 1 copy of the protective variant, and about 1 in 100 people, or 1% of the population, is expected to have 2 copies of this protective variant, bringing their risk of Crohn's disease down compared to other people. As I just said, you're going to get 2 different results, either 2 copies of the non-protective, 1 copy of the non-protective, 1 copy of the protective, or 2 copies of the protective variant, and that's because we all have 2 copies of every gene. We get 1 copy from each of our parents. On every report, you'll notice that we give you the genetic address of the variant that we're looking at. So in this case, it's in the IL-23R gene. And this is located on chromosome 1p31, and that's really just the address, where in the entire genome you can find this gene. The IL-23R gene encodes a cytokine receptor on a subset of effector T cells, and SNPs in this gene tend to be involved in immune or inflammatory related processes. We've seen in studies that have been published in the medical literature that this gene is associated with a strong protective effect against Crohn's disease, so meaning that individuals with variation in this gene have a reduced risk of Crohn's disease, as well as ulcerative colitis. There have been some studies looking at the relationship between this gene and another common gastrointestinal disease, celiac disease, but that same protective effect has not been seen for celiac disease. Again, the studies have shown that the protective effect is seen specifically in Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, but not celiac disease. It's important to think about what a protective variant means versus a risk variant, and this can be confusing for some of our participants. We've gotten some feedback that they need some additional education in this area, So let me just talk for a minute about what this means. We present all of our results in terms of relative risk. So this means that one group is used as the standard against which others are compared. The most common variant in the population is considered the standard. So if 100 people have if out of 100 people, 90 people have a certain variant, that's going to be set as the standard. And we're going to look at how the other version of the gene at that particular spot, the other variant, impacts risk. Does it increase risk or does it decrease risk, meaning that it's protective? So in this case, the standard, the non-protective variant, is the G variant, and the less common variant is the A variant, which is seen as protective. So it's decreasing your risk as compared to the standard. It doesn't mean that those people with the standard, with the more common variant, have an increased risk. In all of your risk reports, there's a risk summary page, which illustrates your risk based on multiple factors. And in here, in the Crohn's disease report, you can see that we've included the genetic variant, family history, and your smoking status, all of which impact your risk for Crohn's disease. If we focus in just on the genetic variant risk, you can see that somebody who has 2 copies of the non-protective variant will have a relative risk of 1. That's sort of the baseline risk that that's used across the board, against which an increase or a decrease is compared. So for somebody who gets this result, they receive this interpretation. Based on your genetic result, you are at a higher risk to develop Crohn's disease compared to somebody with the protective variant. So this doesn't mean that your risk is increased per se, but if you compare to somebody who has a decreased risk, somebody with the protective variant, your risk is higher than them. And if you look at this, for example, somebody getting into a car. We all drive a car almost every day, if not every day. And somebody who gets into the car is not necessarily at an increased risk to be injured due to a car accident. But somebody who gets into their car and puts on their seatbelt is at a decreased risk to be injured due to a car accident. So there's a difference between increased risk and decreased risk. The person who doesn't wear their seatbelt has a higher risk of injury than someone who does wear their seatbelt, but it doesn't mean that there's a greater risk that driving down the road they're going to get into a car accident, right? It doesn't put you off at doesn't start you off at an increased risk. However, wearing a seatbelt does decrease your risk. And so the same thing is true here. A protective variant brings down your risk from the standard, and as a result, people with 2 copies of the non-protective factor are at an increased risk compared to those individuals with the protective variant. If we look at family history actually is a risk factor. If you know that you have a family history of Crohn's disease, this will increase your risk of Crohn's disease. So in this case, someone who has somebody who has a family history of Crohn's disease, a first-degree relative, and a first-degree relative is a parent, a sibling, or a child. Someone who reported to us that they have a first-degree relative with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis is actually at about 3 times the risk to develop Crohn's disease as somebody else, somebody who has no family history of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So just having one first-degree relative actually increases the risk. And you can see with multiple first-degree relatives, the risk is even higher. It's about 7.4 times as high. Smoking also has an impact on risk. Somebody who is a smoker has 1.8 times the risk of developing Crohn's disease as somebody who is a non-smoker. And this specifically is somebody who told us that they are a current smoker as opposed to a former smoker. So one of the reasons that we hear from our participants that they joined the CPMC study originally is to learn not only their risk information, but how this information might impact their children. So I want to take a minute and go through what the implications of these results are for your family members. So in this particular case, we have two parents here, each of whom has one copy of the protective variant. So if both you and your spouse are in the study and these are your results, we can predict what the potential results would be for your children. So we know that for a couple where each of them are a carrier of this protective variant, each of them have one copy of the protective variant, there's a 25% chance that each of their children would have 2 copies of the non-protective variant. There's a 50% chance that each of their children would have 1 copy of the protective variant, and there's a 25% chance that each of their children would have 2 copies of the protective variant. Now there's a distribution here, and it's not possible to tell where each child will fall out without actually testing the child. So we can estimate these are the chances of each result occurring in each child, but without testing an individual, we can't know for sure which result somebody would fall into. There are always limitations to every test that's run. In this particular case, we just want to point out a few of the result limitations. One of the most important is that CPMC results are not diagnostic, nor do they rule out your chance for developing Crohn's disease. This is very important. As we discussed in the initial part of the talk, when we were looking at that scale image, Crohn's disease is not 100% genetic. There are both genetic and environmental contributions, and we're looking at just one of the genetic contributions out of many that contribute to this disease. And so it's really important to note that we cannot diagnose Crohn's disease, nor can we rule out all risk entirely of Crohn's disease based on these results. Again, there may be other genetic variants or risk factors for Crohn's disease that were not included in the CPMC report. Your age, family history, or lifestyle may have a greater impact on your risk to develop Crohn's disease than a single variant. Relative risks used to estimate your risk of disease are based on groups of people with the same risk factors as you. So these are really numbers that are based on population studies. Risk factors may be related to each other and therefore can't be combined. Although we have the risk summary slide where we show you the 3 different cylinders, the genetic risk, the family history risk, and your risk based on your smoking status, those all overlap. If you think about your family history, you get both your genes from your parents, but you often pick up behavioral traits from your parents. We learn our eating habits from our parents, our exercise habits from our parents, and in many cases, if a parent is a smoker, a child is a smoker. And so because of the overlap between those factors, we can't just look at all of those numbers and add them up to give you one composite risk score. The risk for non-genetic risk factors is based on information you provided to us when you completed your baseline medical and lifestyle questionnaires. If that has changed over time since you originally completed your questionnaires, those numbers may be different. And the CPMC genetic counselors are happy to walk you through those results and talk to you about how your risk values might have changed over time. We do intend to ask you to update your medical history in the near future, and we'll be sending out emails asking that you log into the web portal and do that as soon as the survey is ready. You also might have noticed that we provide risk information based on your race or ethnicity. However, data is not always available for all races or ethnicities for all risk factors. So on the bottom of each result, you'll see a little notation that shows what population the data is drawn from. We, of course, try to match that to an individual self-reported race or ethnicity, but unfortunately the data is not always available, and in those cases we default to Caucasian risk information. There's always a "What do I do now?" tab on your report, and this is one way that you can see where there's an upcoming seminar like the one you've attended tonight, or there are also buttons that you can email a question to a CPMC genetic counselor, watch a video that we have online, or read information that we have, educational information about the condition, or you can schedule an appointment to talk to a genetic counselor. Appointments with the CPMC genetic counselors are free, and we're happy to talk to you either in person in our offices in Camden or by phone at your convenience. For more information, you can also go to the CPMC homepage and find education both on genetics in general and also about the health conditions that we've included in the CPMC to date. We do have some additional conditions that we hope to include soon, and we're moving towards incorporating more and more health conditions into the CPMC study, as well as drug gene pairs. I want to remind you and urge you to complete your outcome surveys. Really, the goal of the CPMC study is to figure out what the impact of personalized medicine is. If we give you genetic information and other risk information for a variety of health conditions, is that information valuable to you? What do you do with it? Will it motivate you to change your behavior in any way? Will it motivate your healthcare provider to do any additional tests, make any recommendations, or is it simply information that they find useful or not useful? The only way for us to find that information out is to survey you and ask that you complete those surveys. So you'll see in your questionnaires section, there will be a list of outcome surveys. They take about 5 minutes to complete, and as many as you're willing to complete, we would love to have your data. This is really valuable information to us. So I want to thank you for your participation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.